Welcome to this week's edition of Talk on Nevada. I'm your host, Andy Matthews, and this week we are talking about taxes. Joining me is Geoffrey Lawrence, fiscal policy analyst at the Nevada Policy Research Institute. Jeff, thanks for coming back.
It's my pleasure, Andy.
So, Nevada's legislators have reached an agreement, finally, on a tax package. Give us the bottom line on that, Jeff.
Well, this tax package was the result primarily of a compromise between Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans. And they agreed to a total tax package of $780 million in additional revenue that would take the form of an increase in the payroll tax, an increase in the sales tax, and also an increase in the amount of revenue that they would collect from the registering motor vehicles across the state. Now, the Senate Republicans' agreement to this tax package was conditional upon the Senate Democrats conceding to three conditions, which the Republicans wanted to see. First was they wanted to see reform of the public employees' retirement system in order to reduce the long-term obligations that state taxpayers have towards public employees in the state. Second, they wanted to have a sunset provision for all of the new taxes, so that these taxes would end after the 2-year period is over, and hence it would just be temporary taxes. And third provision was they wanted to enact a tax study that would examine the revenue structure that the state has in the interim period between sessions.
A lot of people now are debating this question of who won and who lost. And that's natural anytime you have a compromise, which is the case here. You want to assess which side got more of what it wanted. And I want to ask you that question, but not in terms of who won, Republican versus Democrats, or even with some of the key players here, Senator Raggio, Senator Horsford, from a philosophical standpoint. In a sort of a contest between those who want to grow and expand the role of government and those who want to limit the size and scope of government, who are the winners there?
Well, this clearly cannot be regarded as a victory for fiscal conservatives in any sense. In fact, it's clearly a resounding defeat for fiscal conservatives, because this tax package, combined with the room tax hike that was passed earlier in the session, will amount to a $1 billion tax hike over the course of the biennium, which is about a 20% increase in the total tax burden that taxpayers within Nevada will bear.
Part of the compromise, of course, are these sunset provisions that you talked about. And that could be seen as sort of a silver lining for those fiscal conservatives that you mentioned. What are the odds that these taxes really are, in fact, going to be temporary?
It's always possible that these tax increases could be temporary. In fact, that's how the legislation is written, although it's highly likely that when legislators return for the 2011 legislative session, they'll regard those tax increases as necessary in order to fund their proposed spending package. So it's highly unlikely that you'll see these taxes go away after 2 years, I would say.
Governor Gibbons, of course, is vetoing this tax package, as he has been saying for some time that he would. And, of course, now it's back in the hands of the legislators. Where does it go from here? I mean, is there still some negotiating to be done before we get to the point of the veto override, assuming that there is in fact one?
Well, that's a good point, Andy. It's not a done deal as yet. With the governor vetoing this tax package, it will go back to the legislators, and they will have an opportunity to override that veto with a 2/3 vote from each house of the legislature. Now, it's entirely possible that some of the legislators who voted in support of that measure before it went to the governor could change their vote when it comes back for the veto override. And that appears to be dependent on whether or not the reforms to the public employees' retirement system go through as they had been negotiated.
You wrote a commentary recently that ran in the Reno Gazette-Journal. I want to quote here part of what you had to say. You said, elected officials in Carson City have always had difficulty defining the term essential services. Every 2 years, new services that had not previously been included in the mix of what was essential are created in Carson City and forever after become part of what is called essential. This cycle of perpetual government growth has many policymakers claiming that the state now needs $7.9 billion to fund the current definition of essential services. Only 8 years ago, $3.6 billion was sufficient to meet a much more narrow definition of essential services. The truth is that our elected officials have no idea what this term means. The reason is that they have been either unable or unwilling to set clear priorities and weigh the relative importance of one government program against another. Some government endeavors fail to achieve their desired results and, hence, should fall into a new category called expendable services. Give us some examples, Jeff, of what you would consider to be expenditures that fall into that category of expendable services.
The one thing that comes to mind is that after the 2003 tax hikes, which had previously been known as the largest tax hikes in state history, the legislature returned in 2005 to find that they had a bevy of additional revenue available, with which they proceeded to create new programs. Now, these programs were programs that had not existed in Nevada prior to 2005, and upon which Nevada was not dependent for its success. In fact, some of the quickest economic growth that's ever occurred in the state occurred prior to 2005. So, looking back at these programs that were new, things such as full-day kindergarten, expansion of class size reduction program, these are programs that have not been demonstrated to significantly boost student performance, which is supposed to be the goal. So these are programs that I would look to first as categorizing as expendable.
Well, Jeff, we'll certainly continue to monitor this situation closely. I do want to thank you for coming back and joining us this week. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in for this week's edition of Talk on Nevada. I'm Andy Matthews, and I invite you to read more about this issue and other private solutions to public challenges facing our Silver State at our website, mpri.org. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.